He can't provide long-term, Gary whispered to my wife Grace as I was literally holding the pen, about to co-sign the mortgage papers that would help them buy their first house together. My name is Marcus Hill. I'm 44 years old, a residential construction supervisor based in Marietta, Georgia, and I had just committed my credit and financial stability to help my father-in-law and his daughter, my wife, secure a home they couldn't qualify for on their own. I just smiled, nodded once, and signed my name on the dotted line. What Gary Mullen didn't understand was that I wasn't just some construction worker trying to impress his daughter. I'd been in residential construction for 20 years, working my way up from framing crew to project supervisor at 3 different mid-size home-building firms across the Atlanta suburbs. I understood property values, market cycles, zoning regulations, renovation costs, and most importantly, I knew how to read people and situations in ways that came from 2 decades of dealing with contractors, inspectors, buyers, and sellers who all had their own agendas and blind spots. Gary was 68, a retired insurance adjuster who'd spent his career evaluating claims and finding reasons to deny coverage. He had that particular combination of arrogance and penny pinching that comes from spending decades saying no to people who needed help. From the moment I'd started dating Grace 6 years ago, Gary had made it clear he thought she could do better. Not in so many words, but in the way he'd ask what my 5-year plan was, or mention other men Grace had dated who were more ambitious or had better prospects. The kind of subtle undermining that's designed to plant seeds of doubt without giving you anything concrete to confront. Grace and I had been married for 6 years, and while we didn't have kids yet, we'd been supporting her parents through what Gary called a temporary transition period that had somehow stretched into its 3rd year. Gary had lost his job at the insurance company during a merger, and while he collected unemployment and later Social Security, it wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to. Grace felt obligated to help, and I supported that decision because that's what you do for family, even when that family doesn't particularly respect or appreciate the sacrifice. The mortgage signing was happening because Grace and Gary had found a nice 3-bedroom ranch in Kennesaw, about 20 minutes from where we lived. It was a good house in a solid neighborhood, well within their budget if they could qualify for the loan. The problem was Gary's credit had taken some hits during his unemployment period, and Grace didn't have enough income history working part-time at the veterinary clinic to qualify on her own. They needed a co-signer with steady income and good credit, which meant me. I'd spent the previous month reviewing their financial situation, helping them organize documents, and walking them through the pre-approval process. I'd even driven out to look at the house with them, checking the foundation, electrical, plumbing, and structural elements, because that's what I do professionally, and I wanted to make sure they weren't getting into a bad situation. The house was solid, the price was fair, and the monthly payments were well within what they could handle between Gary's Social Security and Grace's part-time income. What made Gary's comment particularly cutting was the timing and the venue. We were sitting in the closing attorney's office, surrounded by loan officers, real estate agents, and the sellers. I had just finished reviewing the co-signer documents, understanding that I was taking on legal responsibility for a mortgage that would show up on my credit report and count against my debt-to-income ratio if Grace and I ever wanted to buy a larger house or investment property. This wasn't a casual favor. This was a significant financial commitment that demonstrated trust and family loyalty. Gary had been quiet through most of the closing process, letting Grace and me handle the paperwork and questions. But as the attorney slid the final signature pages across the table to me, Gary leaned over to Grace and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "He can't provide long-term." Then he glanced at me with that satisfied expression people get when they think they've delivered a clever insult without consequences. The loan officer paused, clearly having heard the comment, and looked uncomfortable. The real estate agents exchanged glances. Grace's face went red, and she started to say something, but I just smiled, shook my head slightly to indicate she shouldn't worry about it, and signed the documents. "Congratulations on your new home," I said to both of them, standing up and shaking Gary's hand as if nothing had happened. What Gary didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn despite 6 years of subtle interrogation about my work and finances, was that my job had evolved far beyond supervising construction crews. Over 2 decades, I'd built a comprehensive network that included property assessors, county clerks, tax attorneys, foreclosure specialists, and private real estate investors throughout the metro Atlanta area. I maintained active relationships with 3 different auction houses, subscribed to multiple property databases, and had developed custom spreadsheet systems to track distressed properties by neighborhood, tax status, and market potential. I didn't just attend tax auctions occasionally. I'd participated in over 200 auctions across 6 counties, successfully purchasing 23 properties for renovation and resale. I understood the intricate timing of Georgia's tax lien processes, the redemption period regulations, the bidding psychology of different investor types, and the seasonal patterns that affected auction attendance and pricing. This wasn't hobby knowledge. It was specialized expertise that had generated over $180,000 in profit over the past 5 years. My property monitoring system wasn't casual browsing. It was a sophisticated early warning network. I'd configured automated alerts through the county databases to notify me of new tax liens, foreclosure filings, and auction listings in 12 specific zip codes where I'd identified the best investment opportunities. I cross-referenced this data with neighborhood demographic trends, school district ratings, and infrastructure development plans to predict which distressed properties would offer the strongest returns after renovation. Which is how I knew, even as I was co-signing Gary and Grace's mortgage, that Gary's previous house in Smyrna wasn't just facing a tax lien. It was heading toward a perfect storm of financial neglect. The property had been on my watch list for 8 months, accumulating penalties at 1.5% per month, while sitting in a neighborhood where comparable properties were appreciating at 7% annually. Gary was essentially paying compound interest to ignore an appreciating asset, creating exactly the kind of opportunity that experienced investors like me actively sought. Gary had owned that house for 15 years, and he'd apparently decided during his unemployment period that property taxes were optional. According to the county records, he owed 3 years of back taxes, plus penalties and interest, totaling just over $8,000 on a house that had been appraised at $185,000. The house had been sitting empty since Gary moved in with Grace and me 2 years earlier, ostensibly as a temporary arrangement while he got back on his feet. What Gary had never mentioned to Grace or me was that he'd been renting out that house under the table to help cover his expenses, but he'd been pocketing the rental income without paying the property taxes. When his tenants moved out 8 months earlier, he'd simply let the house sit empty rather than deal with the tax situation or find new renters. The county had filed the appropriate notices and was moving toward a tax sale, but Gary had been ignoring the certified letters and legal notices. I knew this because I'd been tracking the property on the county website, along with dozens of other distressed properties in my area. It wasn't personal, it was professional due diligence. But after Gary's comment during the mortgage signing, it became something more strategic. The first step was waiting. Tax sales in Georgia follow a specific timeline, and I knew Gary's property was scheduled for the April auction. I spent the next 6 weeks helping Grace and Gary move into their new house, painting rooms, installing fixtures, and handling the dozens small repairs and improvements that come with any home purchase. I was friendly, helpful, and supportive, never mentioning Gary's comment or showing any resentment about his lack of gratitude for the financial risk I'd taken on their behalf. Gary seemed to interpret my continued helpfulness as evidence that his assessment had been correct. He started making more pointed comments about my limited ambition and suggesting that Grace should encourage me to think bigger about my career prospects. He'd mention other men in their neighborhood who owned their own contracting businesses or had moved into real estate development, always with the implication that I was somehow underachieving or lacking vision. Grace was caught in the middle, obviously uncomfortable with her father's attitude, but reluctant to create family conflict. She'd apologized to me privately for his comments, and I'd reassure her that I wasn't bothered by his opinion, which was true. I wasn't bothered because I was focused on the upcoming tax auction and the opportunity it represented. 3 weeks before the auction, I conducted a comprehensive property analysis that went far beyond a casual drive-by assessment. I used my professional access to county building records to review the original construction permits, inspection reports, and any modification history. I cross-referenced utility usage data to confirm the property's vacancy timeline and identify any potential maintenance issues from extended non-occupancy. I researched comparable sales within a half-mile radius, adjusting for seasonal market variations and pending inventory levels. My renovation cost analysis incorporated current material prices from my established supplier relationships, labor rates from crews I'd worked with previously, and permit fees for the specific improvements I'd identified. I factored in carrying costs, insurance, property management fees, and a 15% contingency buffer for unexpected issues. The total investment projection was $36,800 for a property that would appraise at $235,000 to $242,000 after improvements, representing a potential equity gain of $198,000 to $205,000. More importantly, I'd identified this property as ideal for the rental strategy I'd been developing. The Smyrna submarket had rental vacancy rates below 4%, average days on market of 12 days for quality properties, and rental rate growth averaging 6.2% annually over the past 3 years. A renovated 3-bedroom house in that specific neighborhood could command $1,350 to $1,950 per month, providing cash flow of approximately $1,200 monthly after taxes, insurance, and maintenance reserves. This wasn't speculation. It was calculated investment analysis based on detailed market research and professional experience. Gary's tax negligence had created an opportunity that combined immediate equity gain with long-term rental income potential. Exactly the kind of strategic acquisition that separated successful real estate investors from casual buyers. I also researched the tax sale process and discovered that properties with liens under $10,000 typically attracted minimal bidding interest, especially when the tax sale was held on a Tuesday morning when most people were working. The county held these auctions monthly, and attendance was usually limited to a handful of professional investors and property flippers who knew the system. The night before the auction, Gary mentioned over dinner that he'd received some junk mail from the county about his old house, but he'd thrown it away without reading it. Grace asked if there were any issues with the property, and Gary dismissed her concerns, saying the county was always sending out notices about zoning changes and assessment updates that didn't mean anything important. I didn't correct him. I simply nodded and changed the subject to Grace's work at the veterinary clinic. The tax auction was held at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday in the county courthouse. I took a personal day from work and arrived early to review the list of properties and register as a bidder. Gary's house was item number 47 out of 73 properties scheduled for auction that day. The minimum bid was $8,247, representing the full amount of back taxes, penalties, and fees. When they called Gary's property, I was one of only 3 people who raised their hands to bid. The other 2 bidders dropped out after I raised the bid to $8,500, apparently deciding the property wasn't worth competing for at that price. I won the auction with a bid of $8,500, paid the required deposit, and completed the paperwork to take ownership of the property subject to the redemption period. In Georgia, property owners have 12 months from the tax sale to redeem their property by paying the full amount of back taxes plus the auction price and additional fees. I knew Gary wouldn't redeem the property because he didn't have $17,000 in cash, and more importantly, he didn't even know the sale had occurred. I spent the next month quietly researching renovation contractors and getting estimates for the work needed to bring the house up to rental standards. The property needed new flooring, paint, updated fixtures, and some minor electrical work, but nothing structural or expensive. I contracted with crews I'd worked with previously and scheduled the renovations to begin as soon as the redemption period expired. 2 months after the tax sale, I received the deed to Gary's former house. The renovations took 6 weeks and cost $28,000, bringing my total investment to $36,500 for a property that appraised at $235,000 after improvements. I decided to hold the property as a rental rather than flip it, given the strong rental market in that area and the potential for steady income. I listed the house for rent at $150 per month, which was competitive for the neighborhood and would provide a solid return on my investment. I received several applications within the first week, but I wasn't in a hurry to select tenants. I wanted to find the right situation, and I had a feeling that patience would be rewarded. 3 weeks after listing the property, Grace came home from work looking upset. She told me that Gary had received an eviction notice from the landlord of his old house. Apparently, Gary had been renting the property to a friend who had been paying rent directly to Gary without the knowledge of the mortgage company. When the friend stopped paying rent and Gary couldn't cover the mortgage payments, the bank had started foreclosure proceedings. Gary was now scrambling to find alternative housing because he couldn't afford to keep both the mortgage payments on his old house and the rent on their new place. This was news to me, I told Grace. I hadn't realized Gary still owned his old house or that he'd been collecting rental income from it. Grace explained that Gary had been trying to manage both properties to maximize his income, but the situation had become complicated when his tenant moved out, and he couldn't find new renters quickly enough to keep up with the mortgage payments. The foreclosure process in Georgia typically takes 60 to 90 days, which meant Gary would need to find new housing relatively quickly. Grace was worried about her father's financial situation and asked if I thought we should help him find an affordable rental property. I told her I'd be happy to help look for options in their price range. Over the next few days, I researched rental properties in the area and compiled a list of options for Gary to consider. Most of the suitable properties were renting for $1,400 to $1,800 per month, which was within Gary's budget based on his Social Security income and Grace's contribution. I presented the list to Gary and offered to help him visit properties and complete applications. Gary was surprisingly grateful for my assistance, and for the first time since I'd known him, he seemed to recognize that I was competent and helpful. He apologized for any previous misunderstandings and said he appreciated having someone knowledgeable about real estate to help him navigate the rental market. One of the properties on my list was the house in Smyrna that I'd recently renovated and prepared for rental. I included it as an option without identifying myself as the owner, listing it through the property management company I'd hired to handle leasing and maintenance. The description emphasized the updated features, convenient location, and competitive rent. When Gary saw the listing, he was immediately interested. The house was in a neighborhood he knew well. The rent was at the lower end of his budget, and the photos showed a property that was clearly well-maintained and move-in ready. He asked if I could arrange a showing, and I told him I'd contact the property management company to schedule a visit. The showing was scheduled for a Saturday morning. I told Grace I had some work to catch up on and couldn't join them, but I encouraged her to go with her father to help him evaluate the property. I spent that morning at my office, reviewing project schedules and checking email, but I'll admit I was curious about how the showing would go. Grace called me around noon, excited about the house and convinced that it would be perfect for her father. The property manager had been professional and helpful. The house was exactly as advertised, and Gary was ready to submit an application immediately. The only concern was whether Gary's application would be competitive, given his recent financial difficulties and the foreclosure situation with his previous property. I told Grace that rental applications typically focused on income verification and references rather than credit history, especially for older applicants with steady Social Security income. I suggested that Gary should be honest about his situation and emphasize his ability to pay rent consistently going forward. I also offered to serve as a personal reference if needed, given my knowledge of Gary's character and financial circumstances. Gary's application was approved within 48 hours. The property management company contacted him to schedule the lease signing and move-in inspection. Gary was relieved and grateful, thanking me repeatedly for helping him find such a suitable property in his price range. He seemed genuinely appreciative of my support during what had been a stressful and difficult period for him. The lease signing was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 p.m. I arranged to take a long lunch break from work to meet Gary and Grace at the property management office. I wanted to be there to answer any questions and ensure the process went smoothly, given that Gary wasn't experienced with rental agreements and tenant responsibilities. When we arrived at the property management office, Gary was in good spirits, talking about his plans for the house and expressing relief that he'd found a solution to his housing situation. The property manager, Janet, greeted us professionally and began reviewing the lease terms with Gary. Everything was proceeding normally until Janet mentioned that she needed to introduce Gary to the property owner, who preferred to meet tenants personally before finalizing rental agreements. That's when I stood up and extended my hand to Gary. "Hello, Gary. Welcome to your new home." The expression on Gary's face was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, and then a dawning understanding of what had just happened. Grace looked back and forth between us, clearly trying to process the situation. Janet, who had been briefed on the family connection, maintained her professional demeanor, but I could see she was enjoying the moment. "Marcus owns this house?" Gary asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I purchased it at a tax auction 2 months ago," I explained calmly. "The property had been abandoned with unpaid taxes for 3 years. I renovated it and prepared it for rental. When Grace mentioned you were looking for housing, I thought it might be a good fit for your needs and budget." Gary sank into his chair, staring at the lease documents without really seeing them. Grace was the first to speak. "You bought Dad's old house?" "I bought a distressed property that was scheduled for tax sale," I corrected. I had no idea it was connected to Gary until after the purchase was complete. But when I realized the connection, I thought it might be an opportunity to help family, while also managing my investment responsibly. The silence in the room stretched for what felt like several minutes. Gary was processing the implications of what he'd just learned. The house he'd lost due to his own financial negligence was now owned by the man he'd dismissed as unable to provide long-term. The same man who'd co-signed his mortgage, helped him move, and assisted him in finding rental housing was now his landlord. Janet finally broke the silence by asking if Gary wanted to proceed with the lease or needed time to consider other options. Gary looked at Grace, then at me, then back at the lease documents. "The terms are fair?" he asked. "Completely standard," I replied. "Market rate rent, normal security deposit, standard lease terms. You'll be treated exactly like any other tenant, with the same rights and responsibilities." Gary nodded slowly and signed the lease. We completed the paperwork, reviewed the move-in checklist, and scheduled the key exchange for the following day. Gary was quiet during the drive home, but not hostile or angry. He seemed to be wrestling with some internal realization that I couldn't quite read. That evening, after Grace had gone to bed, Gary knocked on the door of my home office. He asked if he could come in and talk. I invited him to sit down, expecting some kind of confrontation or demand for an explanation. Instead, Gary apologized. Not just for his comment during the mortgage signing, but for years of subtle disrespect and doubting my competence. He said he'd realized that while he'd been focused on what I wasn't doing, he'd completely missed what I was actually accomplishing. He'd seen me as a construction worker without ambition, when I was actually a professional who understood real estate, finance, and long-term planning better than he did. "You could have let me fail," Gary said. "You could have watched me lose everything and felt justified in doing nothing. Instead, you helped me find housing, and you're treating me fairly even though I haven't earned that consideration." I told Gary that family loyalty wasn't conditional on mutual respect, and that I'd never wanted to see him fail or struggle. I explained that I'd purchased his former house as a business decision, not as revenge or manipulation. The fact that it had worked out to benefit both of us was fortunate, but it hadn't been planned as some kind of elaborate scheme. Gary moved into the house the following week. I helped him with the moving truck and some minor setup tasks, just as I had when he'd moved into the house I'd co-signed for. The difference was that Gary was now treating me as a competent adult whose opinions and expertise had value. He asked questions about property maintenance, neighborhood changes, and rental market trends. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding how I'd recognized and capitalized on the opportunity his tax situation had created. Over the following months, Gary became a model tenant. He paid rent on time, maintained the property well, and even handled minor maintenance tasks himself rather than calling for service requests. He'd found a part-time job at a hardware store, partly for the income, but mostly because he enjoyed staying busy and helping customers with home improvement projects. Grace was initially uncomfortable with the arrangement, worried that mixing family relationships with business could create problems. But she gradually came to appreciate that the situation had actually improved family dynamics. Gary was more respectful and appreciative. I was more confident about my standing in the family, and everyone understood their roles and responsibilities more clearly. 6 months after Gary moved into the rental house, Grace and I were having dinner when she mentioned that her father had been talking about my long-term thinking and strategic planning abilities. She said Gary had told her friends about how I'd recognized an opportunity that he'd completely missed, and how I'd handled the situation with fairness and professionalism. He says you're the smartest person he knows when it comes to real estate and finance, Grace said. He wishes he'd listened to your advice years ago instead of dismissing your opinions. I smiled and reminded Grace of Gary's comment during the mortgage signing. He said I couldn't provide long-term. Grace shook her head. He was wrong about that. You don't just provide long-term. You plan long-term, invest long-term, and build long-term. Dad understands that now. The situation taught me that sometimes the best response to being underestimated is simply to continue working quietly toward your goals. Gary's comment at the mortgage signing had stung because it dismissed years of steady progress and financial responsibility. But rather than confronting him directly or trying to prove him wrong through arguments, I'd simply continue doing what I knew how to do, recognizing opportunities, making calculated investments, and building long-term value. A year later, the financial results had exceeded even my detailed projections. Gary's rental payments had generated $22,200 in gross income, covering my entire initial investment plus renovation costs, while the property appreciated to an estimated current value of $248,000. The monthly cash flow of $310,000 after all expenses represented a 39% cash-on-cash return on my invested capital, while the property's appreciation provided an additional $13,000 in unrealized equity gain. But the real validation wasn't the financial metrics. It was the strategic positioning this single acquisition had created. I now owned a cash-flowing rental property in a high-demand neighborhood, had established relationships with quality tenants and property management services, and had demonstrated to my wife and her family that my long-term thinking extended far beyond simple job security to sophisticated wealth-building strategies. The rental income was already funding my next investment acquisition, a duplex in Kennesaw that I'd identified through the same systematic property analysis approach. Gary's monthly rent payments were literally capitalizing my expanding real estate portfolio, creating a compound effect where his initial dismissal of my abilities was now directly financing proof of exactly the opposite. This outcome represented what I'd learned over 2 decades in construction and real estate. That sustainable success comes from understanding systems, recognizing patterns, and positioning yourself to benefit when others make predictable mistakes. Gary's financial negligence hadn't been a unique failure. It was part of a common pattern I'd observed and learned to capitalize on professionally. The man who once said I couldn't provide long-term was now directly funding my long-term wealth accumulation strategy. And the mathematical beauty of that irony was something I calculated every month when his rent check cleared. The most satisfying part wasn't the financial return or even Gary's change in attitude. It was the realization that competence and character don't require validation from others to be valuable. Gary's opinion of my abilities had been irrelevant to my actual abilities. His respect hadn't been necessary for my success, but earning both through consistent action rather than empty words had been deeply satisfying. Sometimes the longest-term investment you can make is in your own reputation for reliability, competence, and integrity. Those qualities compound over time, creating opportunities that aren't visible to people who focus only on immediate appearances or superficial measures of success. Gary learned that lesson the hard way, but he learned it. And I learned that providing for family isn't just about financial support. It's about demonstrating through your actions that you're someone who can be trusted with important responsibilities, who thinks beyond immediate circumstances, and who builds value that benefits everyone over the long term. The man who once said I couldn't provide long term was now depending on exactly that ability for his housing, stability, and peace of mind. And the best part was that we were both better off because of it.